at the beginning of the 12th century. Pilgrims to the Holy Land are increasingly falling victim to vicious assaults on the unsafe roads. A small group of French knights make it their mission and purpose in life to protect these pilgrims. Soon, however, they come to realize that sometimes the best form of defense is attack. They call themselves the Poor Knights of Jesus Christ, and unlike their proud secular counterparts, they live like humble monks. For some, they are nothing more than ruthless murderers. For modern secular historiography, they are either religious fanatics or cynical opportunists. For others, such as Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, they fulfilled Jesus' words about the two swords, one for the spiritual battle within, and one for the physical battle without. Welcome to this special book review of The Two Swords of Christ by Raymond Ibrahim. Just to get it out of the way, let's start with what Raymond Ibrahim's book is not. It is not an exhaustive history of the Crusades. Ibrahim does not discuss the political dimensions in detail, nor does he list all the wrongdoings on the part of the regular Crusader armies, or the foolish fighting between Christians that accompanied the Third Crusade in Constantinople. In my view, it is also not a systematic critique of Islam, even though it quickly becomes clear when reading where Ibrahim's sympathies lie. More on that later. Here's what I think his new book is: a passionate work about the phenomenon of military orders, namely the famous Templars and Hospitallers, their incredible story, and their rehabilitation. And while many books about the Knights Templar focus on how the order amassed wealth in Europe, or whether or not they found the Holy Grail, Ibrahim focuses entirely on the sole purpose of these warrior monks: the protection of Christians, which in this context usually means confrontation with Islam. Predictably, Raymond Ibrahim faces hostility for this in our current cultural climate. Okay, but if, like me, you went through the education system in Europe or North America, chances are you learned virtually nothing about the Crusades. Or if you did, it was only about the atrocities committed by Christians in the Holy Land. I will discuss the admirable capacity for self-criticism in Western societies at the end of this video. Ibrahim argues that the idea of a Christianity that could and had to defend itself in the face of threatening circumstances has been lost. The concept of muscular Christianity is probably not something you will hear about in church on Sunday, especially not now, during the Christmas season, when we celebrate the coming of the Prince of Peace. However, this book attempts to argue that scholarly and pious people of the Middle Ages did not necessarily see it as a contradiction that Christ spoke of two swords. And if it hadn't been for courageous monks who defended the church, yes, even with violence, you might not have a church at all in which to sing Christmas carols. So relax. There's plenty of literature about the Crusades with a bias against Christianity, and now here's one with a bias in favor of it. Stick with me. You'll get through this one, my liberal friend. What sparked my interest in this book was that I only recently learned that Raymond Ibrahim, was a student of Victor Davis Hanson, an American farmer, classicist, conservative political commentator, and one of my absolute favorite historians. In fact, VDH, as we fans call him, also wrote a few words about this book, as well as the foreword to the previous books. The Two Swords of Christ is part of a trilogy, following the books Sword and Scimitar and Defenders of the West. Ibrahim begins his book with the chapter, A Land Called Holy, in which he reminds us how space and faith are connected. Christians believe that God became flesh, which means having a physical, very real body and traveling to specific places. It is therefore not surprising that from the very beginning, pilgrims from near and far felt a profound need to visit the Holy Land and Jerusalem in particular. They wanted to visit the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, to see an empty tomb, to assure themselves with amazement that the Easter message was true. In my very first video for this channel, I explored how the fascinating art form of the Way of the Cross came to Europe through pilgrims, and what Saint Francis of Assisi had to do with it. We will meet him again later. Then Islam came, writes Ibrahim. Quote, around 634, the great Arab conquests of history began. Jerusalem was among the first Christian cities to be conquered in 637. After it, the whole of the Middle East and North Africa, which then represented the larger, older, and more sophisticated part of Christendom, was permanently conquered. End quote. Pilgrimages to Jerusalem subsequently became more difficult, even though the Muslim rulers allowed them, at least for a fee. However, contemporary witnesses report oppression and recurring outbreaks of violence against Christians. And so the centuries passed until the situation reached a point where it became untenable. Ibrahim writes with regard to the rise of the Turks, quote, such are the origins of the First Crusade, which Pope Urban II called for in 1095. By then, the Turks, according to contemporary chroniclers such as Matthew of Edessa, had slaughtered and enslaved tens of thousands of Christians, Armenians, Greeks, Syriacs, and European pilgrims, and desecrated and destroyed thousands of churches throughout Anatolia. End quote. And this is where the book kicks off, as we learn about the reconquest of Jerusalem and the founding of the first military order in history. But before we continue, I would like to issue a serious warning. Throughout the book, Ibrahim quotes contemporary sources, and although I am not a big fan of trigger warnings, in this case you should be warned that the descriptions of violence in these sources, especially violence against women, are difficult to stomach. I will not reproduce any of it in this book review. In the first chapters of the book, Ibrahim continues to recount the circumstances surrounding the founding of the Knights Templar. He does so in short, engaging chapters, which is true of the entire book. This makes it fun to read, and although it covers a period of over 500 years, it results in a consistent, well-rounded story, even though a large part of it naturally consists of descriptions of combat operations, a cycle of siege and conquest, attack and counterattack. So that definitely earns it bonus points from me. Ibrahim also takes care to explain the theological foundations behind the rise of the Knights Templar. He emphasizes the characteristics of a Templar knight that made him so different from his secular counterpart: his vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Ibrahim writes, quote, along with offering some nuances concerning the rise of the Templars. The one thing all contemporary and near-contemporary chroniclers agree on is that the poor fellow soldiers of Jesus Christ were sincerely pious and self-sacrificing. End quote. Now, this is important because there were dissenting voices regarding the use of force from the very beginning. On the one hand, there were theological considerations that revolved around the question of when a Christian is permitted to kill. Never, of course, right? It is a sin. But if you fail to protect others, you can become just as guilty. That is the tension that this question creates. On the other hand, there were also dissenting voices for secular reasons, that is, questions of power. From the outset, the battle fought by the Knights Templar and later military orders has also been a battle for control of the narrative. Ibrahim's book is proof that not much has changed in this regard to this day. And even if you haven't learned much about the Crusades, rest assured that in other parts of the world, history is very much alive. The most influential voice of the time, in defense of the Knights Templar, was Bernard of Clairvaux. This key figure, a saint and doctor of the Church, brought Jesus' words about the two swords from the Gospel of Luke to people's attention and linked them to the mission of the Knights Templar. I particularly enjoyed reading the description of the Templars' everyday life, away from the fighting. This is even more true of the second military order that Ibrahim discusses in his book, the Knights of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem. And it's for this reason that the chapter entitled "The Poor of Christ" is my favorite. It describes the establishment of a hospital opposite the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Ibrahim writes, quote, "Although referred to as a hospital, it was more akin to what would today be called a hospice, a place to offer food, rest, shelter, and basic medical services to weary and traumatized pilgrims." End quote. Ibrahim goes on to quote historian Jonathan Riley Smith, quote, "A feature of hospitaler nursing was this: because every poor man and woman was Christ, he or she should have not just good treatment, but the best and most luxurious treatment possible. This was a religious imperative." End quote. The basis for this was the passage from the Gospel of Matthew. "Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." To illustrate how military readiness fits into caring for the poor and sick, Ibrahim quotes author Edwin James King, and it is worth quoting in full because it encapsulates the entire motivation and justification for this phenomenon. Quote, "The older historians love to dwell on the story of how Raymond Ibrahim, the first of the great heroes of their order, deeply moved by the constant dangers to body and soul in which the Christian population passed their lives, formed the design to add to the duties of his order the defense of the Christian faith, how it long formed the subject of his earnest meditations and prayers, until at last the divine call came to him, and he summoned his monks together, and proposed that they should take up in defense of their fellow Christians those swords, which they had flung aside when they entered the service of the hospital. The brethren accepted with alacrity the proposals of their revered master, and it was agreed that whilst they must in no way relinquish their original vows, or relax their care of the sick and the poor, a part of the monks should always be in readiness to take up arms against the attacks of the infidels." End quote. The logic behind this was as simple as it was convincing. In addition to treating the wounds of attacked pilgrims in the hospital, it was best to ensure that attacks did not occur in the first place. I will now skip a few chapters. Don't worry, all the famous names from the Crusades are mentioned by Raymond Ibrahim: Richard the Lionheart, Baldwin IV, the so-called Leper King, and of course, Salah al-Din, or Saladin, about whom he writes the following. Quote, "Lesser known, but no less reflective of his animosity toward Christianity, is that upon becoming vizier of Egypt, Saladin severely persecuted that ancient nation's indigenous Christians, the Copts, including by crucifying or hanging many thousands of them, smearing black tar on their churches, and breaking their crosses off, even though the Copts, who refer to Saladin in their chronicles as the oppressor of the cross worshippers, had nothing to do with the Franks or the Crusades." End quote. Here I would like to briefly touch on the personal story of Raymond Ibrahim. Ibrahim's family left Egypt in the 1960s. He grew up bilingual in the U.S., with English and Arabic, and his cultural heritage is Coptic. The Copts, one of the oldest Christian communities, refer to the evangelist Mark as their founder. I have already explored how this came about in another video on this channel. Ibrahim became a specialist in the Arabic language, and as an expert on Islamic history, his insights into contemporary issues concerning Islam were valued by major networks and newspapers. Nevertheless, Ibrahim refrains from drawing parallels with today throughout the book, except for one passage in which he describes the beheading of Knights Templar and Hospitallers by Saladin, and recalls that the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, known as ISIS, deliberately staged their gruesome films based on this model. The most notorious of these videos shows the beheading of 21 Christians, including 20 Copts, in Libya in 2015. As a side note on this topic, I would like to highly recommend the book, The 21, A Journey into the Land of Coptic Martyrs, by conservative writer Martin Mosebach. It is a surprisingly tender and beautiful work, and Christians in the West in particular should read it. Let's continue with the book. In the chapter with the telling title, Interfaith Dialogue, Medieval Style, we meet Francis of Assisi again, as promised. We are already in the Third Crusade. Ibrahim recounts this incredible but true story of how the most famous saint of the Middle Ages, who is otherwise generally associated with talking to birds, traveled to the war zone in Egypt to convince the Sultan to convert from Islam to Christianity. Even though this attempt ultimately failed, Ibrahim reminds us of a point that cannot be stressed enough. He writes, and I love this sentence, quote, "It is of course notable that even Saint Francis, who nowadays is seen and even epitomized as some sort of passive hippie, was sympathetic to crusading." End quote. Another crucial point in the history of the Crusades, which you may not be familiar with, is the fall of the ancient Christian city of Antioch. If you know your Bible, you will recognize this city from the Acts of the Apostles. It was from here that Paul and Barnabas began their missionary journey. It was in this city that believers in Jesus were first called Christians. And in 1268, one of the greatest bloodbaths of the Crusader era took place here when Baybars I, Sultan of Egypt, and his army entered the city filled with Christian refugees and closed the gates behind them. 17,000 were killed on the spot, and over 100,000 were enslaved. Ibrahim writes, quote, "In the Mamluk train was such a surplus of human booty that the price of Frankish slave women and children plummeted on the Muslim slave markets to just a few silver pieces. End quote. The book repeatedly mentions the enormous scale of the Muslim slave trade, which I appreciate, because the subject is often glossed over when it doesn't fit into the prevailing worldview. Ibrahim cites astonishing and shocking figures that were new to me, including the dreaded Islamic piracy that terrorized the coasts of Europe. I will stop here, about halfway through the book, so as not to give too much away. After the fall of Antioch and later Acre, the Crusaders' presence in the Holy Land comes to an end. Ibrahim goes on to describe the downfall of the Knights Templar, an episode that is better known. But the end of the Templars is not the end of the Hospitallers. From here begins the story of a new beginning, the search for a new home, and knights who, due to circumstances, become a maritime power. This story spans the fall of Constantinople in 1453 to modern times and the beginning of secularization. The Knights of St. John, unchanging in their timeless values, are for me the real stars of this book, and it is to Raymond Ibrahim's great credit that he has brought this story to our attention. He himself sums it up with a bitter undertone. Quote, "As for the Knights of the Hospital of St. John, because no fabulous stories or sensational gossip was attached to their name, time has done the secular, if not increasingly anti-Christian, West's work for it, completely blotting them out of memory." The showdown for the Hospitallers then took place on the small island of Malta. Malta became the last front line in the battle between Christendom and Islam. The next strategic goal on the Muslim side after capturing this small rocky island would have been the conquest of Rome. Yes, that's right, Rome. And I think that's a good point for a little self-reflection, rather than the admirable self-criticism I mentioned at the beginning. Even if you are not religious, or perhaps even reject everything Christian, you should not forget that if you are watching this video in a Western country, you are the heir to a distinctly Christian culture. The values you hold dear, your morals and ethics, which you take for granted, did not just fall from the sky. They are not universal, but rather the fruits of a very distinctive civilization. History could have turned out very differently. That is the big takeaway. History could have turned out very differently, and more than once it came very close to doing so. Fate often hung by a thread, with only a few self-sacrificing, steadfast warrior monks on the front lines, tipping the scales in one direction or the other. Raymond Ibrahim's latest book aims to preserve the memory of these men. I would like to conclude this book review with the following thought. While reading, I was reminded of the phenomenon that, after decades of watered-down, liberal theology of God loves you just the way you are, and just do whatever you want, young men in particular are increasingly desperate to find traditional forms of faith. They want challenging truth and guidance, and as a consequence, to take responsibility themselves, to walk the narrow path, however difficult it may be. I think it's time they receive this message from the church again. The church should not leave it to malicious actors to address the crisis of masculinity. She certainly has something to say to young men who want to become fathers, protectors, self-sacrificing, strong but also humble, compassionate, yes, but not in that naive, sentimental way that often does more harm than good. The Templars and Hospitallers, warrior monks as Ibrahim calls them, always carried two swords, an invisible one with which they fought their demons, temptation, pride, and lust, aware that they were part of fallen humanity, sinners in need of a savior, and a sword, a physical one, for the fight to protect the helpless and defend the faith. They never drew their swords lightly, and when they did, it was only for a righteous cause. But when it mattered, they were uncompromising. Merry Christmas and peace on earth. Thank you for watching.